Hello, my name is Taya Graham, and I'm a reporter for the Real News Network, and welcome to the Police Accountability Report. In this episode, we take a look at powerful police unions and how much influence they have in shaping policy, particularly when it comes to holding cops accountable.
The law basically says it's okay for them to murder a young man and get away with it.
And what happened when a cop was supposed to face discipline for pulling a gun on an unarmed teen?
So I showed up for the administrative hearing for the officer and got there, and they said that there was no hearing scheduled.
But first, we want to discuss a topic that does not get enough attention, but definitely should. In fact, it's the theme of this show. Why is there a separate justice system for police, and what can be done about it? Consider for a second what would happen if you got into a dispute with an employee at a local pizza shop. Then you decide to punch him and bring him to the ground, and it was all caught on camera. Evidence that led to your conviction on assault charges. You figured you would be fired, especially if your job entailed carrying a gun and arresting people. Well, if you're a police officer in Baltimore City, no need to worry. Not only will you keep your job, but the police department does not have to explain why or if you still have arrest powers. To provide some background on this story, I will turn to my reporting partner, Stephen Janis. Stephen, can you tell me about this case?
Okay, this case involved a longtime Baltimore City homicide detective named Daniel Nicholson. His daughter worked at this particular pizza parlor right next to Johns Hopkins University, and his daughter called him and said that she had gotten into a dispute over unwashed dishes with an employee who she, I think, had intimated had turned physical, but it turns out that wasn't true. So he shows up, and I think we're going to be showing the video as we do this. He shows up, and we'll show the video in a sec, and decides to beat up this kid who was working at a pizza parlor. Well, not kid, but young adult. And it all gets caught on camera. And police do an investigation, and he actually gets charged with a crime. So you got a cop who's on duty, comes into a pizza parlor, who probably has a gun on him because off-duty police in Baltimore City are required to carry firearms.
Oh, I didn't know they were required.
Yeah, and ends up beating up this kid, well, actually, the kid actually ends up handling it at the end, but ends up punching this kid and instigating violence, and is supposed to be a police officer. So it's a pretty disturbing incident.
So we actually have a video of this encounter. Can you walk me through it?
Yes. You can see as we're watching the video right now, a young man working at the pizza parlor, just minding his own business. And then, as you'll see coming into the picture right now, you can see Detective Nicholson coming over to like sort of the area behind the counter to talk to the young man. So the young man approaches, and maybe 1 or 2 seconds elapses, and Detective Nicholson just punches him. So let's show you that. So here you can see he just really cold cocks him, I guess we call it, right? Without any provocation on the behalf of this young man.
Right, and then he gets into kind of like a fighting stance, as if he's expecting the young man to hit him back.
Well, and we'll show you this right now, what's amazing is the young man, instead of reacting, is the one who shows like sort of, is cool about this. In the sense, shows like a level head. He walks away, I think, to actually close the register. I'm not sure what he did. Comes back and is simply trying to remove him. And Detective Nicholson hits him again, takes him to the ground. The young man is able to right himself, get up, and able to remove this detective. But interestingly, during the video, and we'll show this, he holds up his hands. Because he doesn't want to be seen attacking, because he must know he's a cop. And it shows you how fraught it is in Baltimore City. That a young man gets attacked.
At all with a police officer.
He gets attacked, but he felt compelled to show the people in that crowd that he wasn't doing it. And I think we have to understand. So Detective Nicholson, we'll get to this, gets convicted. But what's really important to understand is that this kid didn't know that. All he knew was that this guy was a cop, and he comes in and just starts beating him up. So it's a horrible situation. And as you'll notice, no one really helps him out.
And the young man has incredible presence of mind. Not only does he remove the police officer with his hands up, showing that he's not causing any sort of physical contact, any sort of unnecessary harm to the officer, but he moves him completely out of the store with his daughter. It's amazing.
It's amazing. And so what subsequently happened was the police showed up, and the evidence was overwhelming. And Detective Nicholson got charged with, I think, reckless endangerment and second-degree assault.
But this isn't the first time that Officer Nicholson has been in trouble, right? Can you tell me a little bit about his past history?
So 7 or 8 years ago, another incident involving one of his relatives he thought had been kidnapped, which turned out not to be true. And he broke into 2 people's houses and assaulted people. Like literally, you got a police officer who should know you can't just barge into someone's residence without a warrant or without, it's a crime. But what happened was, and I think is instrumental and is actually illustrative of the problem that we're talking about today in terms of 2 systems of justice, the charges were dropped against him, and he kept his job, even though he was charged with storming into people's houses. It's very dangerous.
Right. So you're telling me that this officer kicked down the door into someone's
I don't know
home,
if he
into
kicked
a
down the door, but he
private
broke
residence.
into the house.
He broke into a private residence and terrorized, what, 2 people there?
Yeah, at least 2 people. I think assaulted one and was charged with a variety of crimes. But
And
nothing
the charges
happened.
were dropped.
Charges were dropped, and he was not fired. And this, of course, he comes back and does it again. And that's what's so stunning about this, is because he's proven already that he couldn't control himself and that his temper is dangerous.
Yes.
And yet, the system that we're supposed to have to prevent this, when horrible things happen with people who can't control themselves, and we do all this hand-wringing, did nothing.
So what is Officer Nicholson's employment status right now?
Well, that's what's really key to this story. We don't know. And the reason we don't know is because the police department will not respond to our request to tell us what's going on. I found out through a source that apparently his police powers have been suspended, but he's still getting paid. Okay, so let me sort of reiterate this. He got charged with a crime, convicted of a violent crime, and he's still getting paid. And what I understand is that they're waiting for the administrative process to play out. So in other words, when you're convicted of a crime, after you're convicted, they start the administrative investigation, which is the internal investigation, to decide whether your policies violated the department. So apparently the police department is going to take another 2 years, or who knows, to say, wow, it's really not our policy to have our officers go into pizza places and beat kids up.
Right. So essentially, the police force has someone who is a convicted criminal on the force and has not.
And is getting paid by the taxpayers, but will not tell the media what is going on. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Incredible.
Sorry, I don't mean to get emotional, but to me, as a reporter, transparency is at least the least they can do.
Yeah. So for our next story, we'll provide some context on how a police department can evade scrutiny and why. It might seem counterintuitive that a publicly funded institution can simply refuse to discuss an employee's criminal act. I mean, the police are funded by our tax dollars, so why should a department not be fully transparent? Part of the answer is the political economy that drives policing. Stephen, before we get to the example of how that works in our state capital, can you elaborate on that idea a little bit? So how do politics, money, and policing mix?
Well, when you take a town like Baltimore that is very much a town of governance, where government kind of intercedes in everything, the biggest institution, the most moneyed institution is policing. Therefore, that money that policing generates gets recycled into the political system. In other words, the FOP has a ton of members who pay a lot of dues, and those dues get recycled into the political process. So what happens is that policing becomes an industry that has, I guess you would say, a political constituency in those politicians, because so many police officers donate to campaigns. The FOP donates so much money and pays so many people. And the institution itself employs so many people, from the courts, to the sheriff's office, to the police department. It's billions of dollars. And it ends up running the town. It's just like, if you're in an oil town, or if you're in a town that has, like Silicon Valley, run by, the tech industry.
Companies. Right, that's a good point.
Our industry is policing. And it has been policing. We are absolutely engulfed in policing. And so that turns into a political economy, because all the politicians make money off of it. All the institutions make money off of it. Right. And it becomes a self-serving kind of thing. We have to do whatever we can to preserve policing. And policing becomes incredibly powerful.
So now we're going to play a video clip that reveals exactly how this process works. It's a dynamic between police and legislators that's rarely made public.
Okay, and number 4 says, after final actions taken by the head of the Labor Enforcement Agency, the findings shall be provided to the public. Do you have any problem with that?
No problem with that.
Okay.
The issue was a law named for Anton Black, a young man who died during an arrest in September of 2018. The law was supposed to improve transparency for police-involved killings. Anton was a 19-year-old track star and aspiring model who was chased by Greensboro, Maryland police after a white woman called 911 and accused him of trying to kidnap his 12-year-old cousin. The chase ended at Anton's mother's house, where he was taken to the ground and died during the struggle. The medical examiner's office ruled his death an accident, and the officers weren't charged. But an independent pathologist consulted by The Real News said Anton's death was the result of positional asphyxiation. But Antons Law was supposed to ensure that information about a police officer, including their past history of complaints, should be made available. The law was in part due to the fact that the officer who initially tried to arrest Anton, Thomas Webster, had a lengthy record of excessive force complaints that were not disclosed to the state agency that certifies police officers. But with questions about Webster's past and the tragic death of this young man in the background, one would think legislators would act. But that's not what happened. As you can see in the clip, the law was completely watered down. In fact, the only aspect of police accountability it addressed was access to internal disciplinary hearings, and even that small change prompted pushback. As you can see here, the state's legislative body is actually asking police unions for permission. That's right, permission to amend the law. Your elected officials kissing the ass of the police union when it was their actions which caused the problem in the first place.
So it's just 3 you have there, and then at the bottom of that page is if a complaint is filed against a law enforcement officer involved in the death, then we have these additional things. Any problem with that on page 4?
No problem, and to Delegate Clippinger credit, he amended it to death only for us.
So if we just take this bill as it is and just change from audio recording to written transcript, you're fine with this bill?
Written transcript with a cost, so.
With a cost to
right,
produce
the burden, and it's going to be could be pricey.
Stephen, how is this possible, and what kind of law is actually being passed?
Well, you know, the police, when you go down to Annapolis, the police are one of the most powerful lobbies because, again, we talk about the FOP. You know, we're a state that doesn't have a lot of industry, but a lot of governance. And there are police unions for each and every jurisdiction. And then there's a state level police union. And they all work in tandem. And they run the show down there. I mean, we sat in a committee, the committee of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, which is chaired by Senator Bobby Zirkin. And as you pointed out one time, you said to me they were giving him hand signals. Well,
absolutely. There was a member of the FOP sitting there with a piece of paper. And as Zirkin was speaking, he actually looked as if he was checking off on the piece of paper that he was hitting specific talking points. And I believe he gave Zirkin a thumbs up at one point.
They come down with their uniforms and they come down and, you know, they basically dictate the process. And you can see it right here. I mean, this is something that's obscure. It's something you're not usually see as a lay citizen, but we watch, and we want people to see it because these are the people that you elect, and you should know what they're doing. And when you've got a situation like Anton, where a police officer had a horrible record, you know, we've shown the video, and we'll show it right now. There's video of him kicking an African American man, breaking his jaw. He ends up
while the man is complying, he is complying with the police orders, he kicks the man and breaks his jaw.
And again, the system put into place, which is the state should have been made aware of this because he came from Delaware, he came to Maryland to get a job, Officer Thomas Webster. The procedures that were supposed to be put in place to ensure that an officer with that kind of record doesn't end up having police powers in Maryland completely failed. So what happens? A legislator introduces a bill to address that, and it just gets watered down by the police unions. And we spoke to Anton's sister, Latoya, and she talked a little bit about how she felt about this. Let's play that clip. Do you think this other bill has any merit that the other one that has been sort of the watered down version of the bill that you wanted passed?
No, I don't. And one thing that I did expel upon earlier today is that even the delegate that proposed that bill didn't even have the decency to contact the family to ask us permission to name it after Anton. Or to give us any information about the bill. I actually had to learn about the bill from Delegate Acevero, who had the decency to call me personally and ask for permission to name House Bill 1011 after Anton, which, after discussing with the family, we all, of course, gave our blessing. I did discuss with the family this new House bill, and we all agree we will not support it. We are opposing it.
So you can see the pain of the family, you know, is just deep because I think they feel
devastated.
Like they're showing up in Annapolis, they're trying to effectuate change that will benefit everyone, trying to prevent another Anton, and yet, you know, the police unions step up there and it's like, please, can we do this? I mean, how can elected officials be so beholden to such a small group of people?
So can you explain what the internal trial boards are and what their role is in holding police accountable?
Well, internal trial boards are administrative bodies that are, you know, under the auspices of the police department that investigate complaints that aren't criminal usually. So, you know, if you get a complaint against you by a citizen, say he roughed me up in an arrest, or if you didn't show up to work on time, or any sort of labor issue or issue with your performance, well, not performance, but issue with your behavior, ends up on an internal trial board, which can then decide whether you're guilty, and then mete out punishment. So, and then it goes to the commissioner. But basically, it's like the last step in the process where it's like a trial with kind of not a jury, but a tribunal with 3 or 4 police officers who judge whether or not what you did is, worthy of punishment. But of course, you can see the problem with that whole idea.
Right,
You just have
because the
cops judging
police
cops.
are policing other
Yeah.
police. Now, what's interesting is on that trial board, didn't it used to be that the officer who was being tried was actually allowed to choose 2 of the officers who were on that trial board? Is that correct?
Yeah, they were allowed to choose 2 people. So 2 out of 3.
2 out of 3 people
So what's going to happen
that you
to
get to choose.
Yeah. Which is, again, part of the union and part of the FOP contract and part of, I believe, part of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which is something we should mention. It's very important to understand.
Right.
Maryland has one of the most, I should say, generous law enforcement officer Bill of Rights. It protects almost everything police do, and it's part of the reason that it's very difficult to do any sort of reform, because for a long time, people in Baltimore had asked to have one, citizen on these trial boards. 2 cops, 1 citizen. Cops still win. And they fought it tooth and nail. They finally, I think, agreed in principle to do it, but they were able to prevent it in Annapolis. So, I think that shows, again, the problem that we're talking about.
Right. And just to illustrate the apparent futility of the final version of the watered-down Antons Law, we need to look no further than the case of Baltimore police officer Damon Duran. As we reported on the show before, Durant pulled a gun on an unarmed teen who was waiting for a bus in 2017. The Baltimore officer was not on duty and never identified himself as a cop. We interviewed the victim, Juwan, and his mother, Erica Hamlet, as they tried to pursue a complaint against the officer.
They treated us like we were criminals, and I was like, I'm not doing that. We're not criminals. We're here to give a statement because we filed a complaint. And then they asked me to refrain from social media, don't do any interviews.
So as you can see, it's hard enough to simply file a complaint against an officer. But then when the officer was supposed to face the same internal disciplinary board that was the subject of the watered-down Antons Law, something happened. Nothing. I'll let Erica tell the story.
So I showed up for the administrative hearing for the officer and got there, and they said that there was no hearing scheduled for that date. But according to the website, there was actually 2 hearings scheduled for the 2nd and the 4th. He said wasn't going to be any hearings until the 9th at least.
And has there since been a hearing for Officer Durant that you know of?
Nope, not that I know of.
So how do you feel about that?
It's exhausting, basically, because you follow the steps of all of the steps that they make you privy to. The information that's posted online is supposed to be public knowledge, and none of the things are updated or accurate.
So basically what happened was, even though you had filed a complaint, they just didn't have the hearing and didn't tell you anything.
Correct.
So the bottom line is the public hearing where Officer Durant was supposed to face public scrutiny never happened, and the victim was left in the dark completely. And here again, the futility of the watered-down legislation becomes clear. No matter how bad police behave, no matter how terrible the consequences are for the family of the victims, the political economy of policing ensures nothing will change. Stephen, is there anything we can do to fix this?
Well, yes. I think, there has to be some sort of way to limit the influence of police unions. It's like especially in Baltimore City, it's like an unholy alliance,
Right.
And I think that, the majority of the people have to be heard somehow in some way. I think reform efforts have to start with civilian input. I think we talked about it a lot on the Real News Network, that civilian control of police is where it starts, right?
Yes.
A mayor is going, if a mayor gets 100,000 donations from the FOP, she or he is pretty much bought. But if you have a civilian board, which incidentally, Councilman Brandon Scott wants to start, where a civilian board would appoint the police commissioner, who, maybe they're elected, maybe they're appointed, maybe they're ad hoc from a council, like each council person gets to appoint one person, whatever. But the point is, you disentangle that political economy.
Yes.
You disentangle that relationship between money and policing that has created this unholy politician alliance that we see. So I think the thing is to put civilians in charge in a way that severs it from what we have here in Baltimore, and maybe it will be a start. It's not panacea for everything, but a start.
Now, Stephen, one aspect of policing that gets a lot less attention is the pensions. Can you talk about these pensions, the amount of money that's involved, things like that?
Yeah, and that's another thing. we look around our streets in Baltimore. We see potholes. We see rec centers closed. You and I did a very long story on rec centers, and we don't realize that the city spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year on police pensions. Police pensions is like the down the road bribe from politicians. Over the years, politicians have given more and more generous police pensions to police and firefighters. And over time, it's become more and more costly.
Yes.
And that includes health benefits. Even though, for example, police officers could be on Medicare after 65, the city still pays their health benefits. So the pension fund has billions of dollars, and it's still underfunded because a person for a while, for only 20 years, at the age of 41, could retire and have salary for life, 2/3 of their salary.
2/3 of their salary.
I mean, so every year the city has to put $150 million into a pension fund. Now imagine what $150 million could do for potholes or parks or after-school activities. So this is just a sunk cost that is so, damaging to a city like Baltimore, and it's not really recognized. And that doesn't even include money for officers who are injured or officers who go on disability. That's a $40-50 million line item that just no one talks about. So you start adding it up and you see big numbers, $200-300 million. So, which is more than our Rec and Parks budget, and the same as our what we spend on schools. We spend probably as much on pensions and post-retirement benefits for police and fire than we do on schools. Now, what kind of future does the city have with that? And we put during this thing, let's put a graphic so people can see it. Mm-hmm. There's this huge amount of fixed costs, mostly pensions and disability, money for injuries.
Right.
And that pretty much puts the city in almost an impossible fiscal situation.
Especially for a city that is already impoverished and dealing with multiple problems.
We're one of the poorest cities in the country. I mean, in terms of the number of people in poverty for our size, we are the poorest jurisdiction in the state, and we pay more towards police than any jurisdiction. Now, why does that happen? It's because of this, great sort of funnel of money that goes in policing, which, again, 80% of police officers live outside the city, so all this money is going out to the counties.
Right.
And then it gets funneled back into political campaigns, and then everybody's like, and look, Baltimore has the worst crime rate of any city in the country. We're one of the most violent cities. So police obviously aren't competent.
Right.
But there's no disengage. There's no police overtime, for example, has been $50 million a year after year. We've had 300 homicides. Nothing has changed. Nothing. And yet we're still paying it. So it just seems to me like there's a disconnect between performance and what we're paying.
We will continue following these stories and others. Also, if you have an issue with policing and you want to discuss it on our show, please contact either myself, Taya Graham, at Taya's Baltimore on Facebook or Twitter, or contact my reporting partner, Stephen Janis. Stephen, what's your Twitter handle?
Investigative V. Investigative V spelled out.
Okay, Investigative V. Got it.
Makes no sense, but that's what it is.
Okay, so please feel free to reach out to us with your stories of your interactions with police in Baltimore City or elsewhere. And thank you all for joining us on the Real News Police Accountability Report.